Hi everyone, welcome back to this week's episode of How to Make Climate Change Sexy with me, Issey Gladston. In this episode, I'll be talking to Seth Thomas. Seth is a biodiversity researcher and communicator, and he's worked on projects with the University of Oxford and conservation agencies like CITES, the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. He also runs one of my favourite nature TikTok accounts under the handle ZethDafer, where he often goes viral for his commentary on the natural world. In this episode, we discuss the trade of endangered species in the fashion industry. It was such an interesting episode to record as I went into this topic in a rather defensive way. And through the process of reading the paper that Seth contributed to and talking to Seth, it really opened up my perceptions of conservation and also solutions to the climate and ecological crisis we face. So I hope that you'll also do the same, because I really want this podcast to be a space of exploration and pragmatism, rather than one in which I tell you dogmatically what's right or wrong, or what you should be buying, or exactly what you should be doing. I think ultimately for me, in my ideal world, nature wouldn't be something that enters this economic realm, and it would be something that we protect for its inherent value. But I also feel like in our current crisis, we're at risk of losing so much biodiversity and so much nature, and I think it's really interesting to learn how these pragmatic systems operate. It's certainly a very different approach to last week's episode, where we were talking about total ethics fashion, but I also do think that they both fit into the jigsaw of solutions to the climate and ecological crisis. So in total ethics fashion, it lays out the issues that we face now, but it also laid out quite a vast vision for the future. And as you'll learn in this episode, the trade of some endangered species ensures that we still have them for these futures that we're imagining. I think there's just kind of two ways to approach the climate crisis. There's definitely a very pragmatic way, and a way that emphasizes theory of change, and there's also a way that emphasizes the end point and where we want to get to, and I think they're both equally as valuable. I think we all need something positive to aim for, but I think sometimes what's lacking is that building that bridge of how we're going to get there. What's our theory of change? What are the things that we need to do? How are we going to hack the system that we're currently in? I think that's something I'm really passionate about, is hacking the system that we're in rather than rebuilding it from scratch, because ultimately we only have the next 15 to 20 years to sort these things out, and I think that rebuilding systems entirely might not be feasible in that space. And it's about, how do you hack the system that we have to make sure that we even have these species left for this future that we're all trying to build. Let's get into this discussion, and we're going to learn more about how endangered species are traded for fashion and other purposes, and how this can actually help build some populations. Hi Seth, welcome to How to Make Climate Change Sexy. For everyone who doesn't know you, I was wondering if you could introduce yourself.
My name's Seth Thomas. I work as a researcher at the University of Oxford right now, focused on nature-based solutions, but I've done a lot of different stuff, from studying how you reintroduce large carnivores into the wild, like lions, tigers, and bears, to working on sustainable wildlife trade, which is what we'll be talking about today.
So yeah, we're going to be talking about the sustainable wildlife trade and how that helps us manage the biodiversity crisis, and also how fashion plays into the biodiversity crisis, but can also be part of the solution. Now, I think it's important, before we have this conversation, to state what biodiversity is, because a lot of people in fashion have this carbon tunnel vision, and we think just about our emissions and hitting net zero, and we don't really consider the wider impacts of the industry. It's a very, very narrow approach, and I think biodiversity is obviously something that's incredibly important. So I was wondering if you could tell us what it is and why it's important on a global scale.
Yeah, so biodiversity is kind of the diversity of all life on Earth. So you can break it down into things like species diversity, you can break it down into ecosystem diversity, so the difference between a desert and a wetland, and you can also break it down into genetic diversity. So the pigeons in your backyard in London are different genetically than the pigeons in New York, even though they look about the same. And all of those different components are really important to supporting happy and healthy life on our planet, as well as making sure that our lives continue to be happy and healthy on our planet, because biodiversity kind of underpins all of the different things that we know in modern society as kind of what we've grown to accustomed to, whether it's bees pollinating our food or the fish in the sea. There's a ton of things we depend on for biodiversity, so I'm definitely anti-team carbon tunnel vision, and I think that biodiversity is a way bigger part of the puzzle.
Yeah, and also, isn't there kind of a way that if we start tackling biodiversity, we actually inadvertently deal with the climate crisis at the same time?
Yeah, so biodiverse ecosystems hold more carbon than kind of unbiodiverse ones. So if you're thinking about maybe a lot of different brands you've seen plant trees, if you buy a pair of their sweatshirts or socks or shoes or whatever, well, you want to make sure about how they're planting those trees as well. So for example, like an old growth forest is going to be able to store way more carbon than just kind of a tree plantation, which a lot of brands actually do plant as part of their promotions.
So biodiversity is this thing that's like incredibly precious on a global scale, on a local scale. But what are the main drivers of biodiversity loss? Like why are we struggling with it right now?
So I think biodiversity is being pressured from basically every direction possible. So you're going to have land use change as the single largest driver of biodiversity loss. So that's when we're cutting down rainforests and turning them into housing or using them for farming or using them as waste dumps. Another major loss of biodiversity is direct consumption. So things like fisheries are cutting down forests for wood. Any form of something that might come from the natural world that we use in our everyday lives is a form of direct consumption. Climate change also has a really big interplay with biodiversity. So these species have spent millions of years evolving for their specific spot on planet Earth. And as climate is kind of really rapidly changing on a scale that we've never seen before, a lot of these species are no longer able to thrive in those places that they were put on Earth. So they're kind of stressing out. A lot of species aren't able to adapt. Think about coral reefs around the world, where those really high temperatures are causing them to bleach and they're not really able to live in their environment anymore as they adapted to it. And there's also other common issues that we think of, like pollution, that is really just kind of impacting biodiversity on a global scale as well.
Yeah, and I think that's something that fashion also plays a massive role in biodiversity loss. Like if we look at leather and viscose, they're two key causes of biodiversity loss in fashion material. Like you mentioned old growth forests, and actually a lot of viscose comes from old growth forests. And then the chemicals used to process the viscose from wood into fibre also end up going into groundwater and polluting the water and soil, which also increases habitat loss. With leather, there's the same issue of cattle ranching and deforestation. So a big misconception about leather is that it's a byproduct of the kind of cattle ranching, where in reality it's more of a co-product. And in 2019, the wildfires that destroyed a lot of habitat were in part attributable to deforestation. And also the livestock industry, you mentioned coral reefs. It also causes a lot of water pollution and creates dead areas in coastal areas and degradation of coral reefs. So this is something that's incredibly important to protect and that's incredibly under threat at the moment. So what are the ways in which we can protect biodiversity?
So the entire kind of conservation movement originally sprung up kind of over a century ago now, where people were kind of realizing that, oh, we've kind of degraded a lot of these places and we need to find different ways to kind of repair them and things that we can do to save them. So conservation looks like a lot of different things. It can look like building reserves, it can look like reducing our use, it can look like stopping pollution. And it's really transformed over the last kind of 100 years as well since it's been created. When it first started, it was a lot of people going in and being like, oh my gosh, all these species are disappearing. We're going to kick everybody off this land. We're going to build a fence around it and we're going to let them recover. And as that's gone on, we've begun to kind of realize that we need to actually, instead of kicking people off the land, maybe we should be asking why that community is the community in the area that does still have trees around it or does still have this wildlife around it. And they've found ways to coexist with these species and cohabitate with them. And I think there's a lot to learn from that. And as species have recovered as well, we've kind of moved towards this idea of how do we support both coexistence as well as sustainable livelihoods for rural communities who are kind of living with that biodiversity. One of my favorite kind of analogies that came out of this year is the Berlin lion debacle. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah.
So obviously, a lot of the biodiversity left in the world is left in Africa, South Asia, and South America, because many places like Europe and North America have really destroyed a lot of the biodiversity that they had. But these are also the places that are generally telling other people to coexist with all of these different forms of wildlife. So in Berlin this year, they actually thought there was a loose lioness and they deployed military helicopters. They had like armored vehicles on the streets. They deployed troops for one lion. And these are the same people that are and telling other people, it's fine. Like, don't worry about it. You shouldn't like ever clash with the lions. You should just coexist. And so I think there's a lot as we've like transferred and realized there's a lot to learn from these communities and who actually coexist with these species and have had long traditions of sustainable use of them and integrating them as part of their livelihoods. That's kind of the new era of conservation, is working with communities rather than kind of excluding them.
Yeah, that's such a funny point that like the way that we kind of flare up about it in the West compared to like how these communities can manage themselves and need to be supported in that. So you did some research for CITES. Can you explain to the audience what CITES is?
CITES is the Convention on Trade in Endangered Species. So it's an international agreement between basically every country in the world in terms of monitoring what species are traded between them on international trade. So specifically in the scope of CITES, they get the right to kind of classify species as either Appendix 1, meaning that there's no international trade, it is completely banned. So thinking of things like pangolins, which are a really famously traded animal, or things like ivory is banned on the international stage, and that's under CITES. And they also have things such as Appendix 2 and 3 species. So they can have species that are managed. So we want to know when they're being traded between countries, but the trade is still legal. Now, the one kind of caveat on CITES and a lot of the different research in this report is CITES really can only capture kind of elements of international trade. So anything that goes on within a country. So if I wanted to sell you a squirrel from like Oxford to London and it was an endangered squirrel, they're not going to pick up on that. But basically all forms of international wildlife trade go through that. And kind of uniquely among a lot of international treaties, it has a fair amount of enforcement power because countries tend to be really into kind of enforcing their borders and protecting their wildlife. Kind of incentivizes a lot of these different countries to actually put some effort into CITES and kind of trying to track all of these different species moving around the world.
And I feel like before I read this report, I had this sense, probably quite a Western approach of like feeling uncomfortable about thinking about the trade of animals. I think probably coming from a very like maybe like an animal rights vegan perspective as a teenager. I think I had this idea that we should just be protecting the animals for the animals' sake. But what are the risks of doing that kind of conservation under our current economic system? Like, how does that affect the communities? You touched on it earlier when you mentioned fortress conservation.
Yeah, so I think that we kind of lump all wildlife and species into this kind of same bucket. And while it's really important to kind of always be researching and studying them, I don't necessarily think it's like a true comparison between all of them. And specifically coming from the West, it often becomes an issue when we're thinking of things that are really charismatic. So like lions, giraffes, tigers, alligators, bears. So we really care passionately about this versus I promise you no one cares about the snowdrop trade, which is actually the most traded legal like species in the world. It's those tiny little flowers you see everywhere. So in terms of how we manage them, I think that people really think about the bans traditionally and that a lot of these charismatic things should just always be banned from being traded. But I think that kind of is a bit naive in terms of what do we do when we've actually succeeded. So for example, in the Northern Territory in Australia, they had a massive population of saltwater crocodiles that the indigenous Aboriginal communities managed kind of historically for thousands of years, where they would harvest some of them, they would use them, they coexisted pretty well. Westerners came in, they absolutely decimated the population during colonization of Australia, and then they imposed really strict bans on all forms of their hunting, and then the population recovered really well, but then all of a sudden they were having all form new types of wildlife conflict and all these different things. And it's kind of how do we create systems now where say we've been successful in some places where species can coexist and we're thinking logically and not necessarily thinking with, oh, this is really cute and fluffy, even though there's thousands of them, like no one should ever be allowed to touch them. Because I think a lot of these communities have historically coexisted with a lot of these species, and we need to be able to let them have stewardship over their own organisms. If, for example, if someone in the United Kingdom told you it was their right to go shoot a pheasant, you wouldn't really question it. But then if someone in another country with an animal that you probably found way cuter and way more fluffy, or just more foreign to you, was doing that, you would probably then question it and criticize that person a lot more. So I think it's often coming from the Western lens, kind of being a bit blinded to what the reality of living on the ground with these species are, but also the reality that these species can have different kind of populations and contexts all around the world. So in some places, they're fine. And I think that's what kind of monitoring wildlife trade is actually really important for. So by monitoring the legal trade part of it, we're able to see when are species doing well, when are they doing poorly. If they're doing poorly, then the CITES Convention has the right to put on trade bans or temporarily suspend to try and see what's happening. Versus if this kind of convention didn't exist, and if there wasn't any regulation of wildlife trade, there'd be a lot of illegal exploitation. And that's not to say that there isn't now. But when you have a legal avenue for this, you can really control it and monitor this trade and monitor how species are responding to it.
And I think also there's an element of social involvement too, like the example that you gave of people in the UK being able to shoot their own pheasants because they own the land, or they just feel like that's appropriate and no one's telling them not to. It made me think about bonobos in the DRC and how they're under threat, and there's a lot of like poaching that occurs, but what wildlife conservationists fail to consider is why are these people poaching? Like, is it incomes that they need? Is it food that they need? And having such a singular vision of conservation is actually incredibly unhelpful when you're considering solutions. So, of course, trading, like you mentioned, trading endangered species has to be tightly controlled and managed. But in what instances can trading the endangered animals be a good thing?
I think going off of the point that you just made, I think part of why endangered wildlife trade can be a good thing is it changes people's relationship with that animal in some cases. So in a lot of rural communities, they don't see a crocodile and think, oh my God, this is so amazing. Like, look at this pretty crocodile. They think, oh my God, it just ate 7 of my cows. How am I going to feed my family? So it's a lot of reframing these animals to making sure that they're viewed as assets rather than just being viewed as a nuisance, as they are in a lot of these rural communities. And by allowing, for example, like legal crocodile trade, you're able to put an economic value attached to these crocodiles, but not only attached to these crocodiles, attached to their habitat, attached to their success, and attached to them thriving. So it is then in the best interest of those people who live in those rural communities to have crocodiles on their land, to see crocodiles thriving, to have them around, because they know that rather than just being an antagonist to their current livelihood, they're actually an active contribution and part of it. And by monitoring these situations, we can see that, for example, in the crocodile trade, it leads to actually increases in crocodile populations and increases in revenue for rural communities. Because kind of as you were saying, a lot of times we don't ask the questions of why are these rural communities coming into conflict with wildlife. And in many cases, it's because these rural communities have either been forgotten by their governments or not actively supported by them. And so by allowing for this diversified income, it really provides kind of a lifeline for them, but also a lifeline to these species as they're kind of being seen as new different forms of economic value for those communities that allows them to kind of coexist. I kind of rambled off there. I don't know.
That's really helpful. I think it's interesting to see how you would shift your viewpoint from being like, this crocodile is a nuisance, I'm gonna probably shoot it on my land, or I'm gonna destroy its habitat or make its life a misery, versus seeing the crocodile and thinking, actually maybe I'll take the hit of it eating 7 of my cows because in the end I'll make money off of it thriving. And I think that we really have to consider people's motivations and people's livelihoods. In what ways do the people who are benefiting from the trade of endangered species contribute to conservation? Like, what are they doing that's making things better for these species?
The people that are benefiting from them, when you begin viewing these animals as kind of both part of the system and not necessarily an antagonist, there's a lot of different ways that you might kind of choose to manage them. And it really changes depending on what that species is, how it reproduces, how it's used. So kind of just continuing the crocodile example a bit before I switch over. If you're a rancher, for example, and you know that there's crocodiles on your land, but they also have economic value for you, when you're considering how you might develop your land, you might leave wetlands, you might leave important riverbanks, you might protect more of their habitat than you would have otherwise, knowing that their survival is something that benefits you overall. But also if you go to species like vicuña, which are kind of basically wild alpacas, if you've never seen one before, that live in the high Andes Mountains in South America, they were competing really heavily for grazing land with a lot of the people who were in these really rural and really dry communities. And so by changing the relationship with how they kind of manage these species, they were able to shear them, which allowed them to bring back a lot of old cultural traditional shearing ceremonies that they used to use for getting this fiber. And they were able to kind of undermine the illegal trade in vicuña. So by legalizing this trade, having formal recognized indigenous trading partners in these countries who are legally allowed to shear, harvest the vicuña, they're able to catch the vicuña once a year, shear them off. The vicuña gets to go free with a new haircut. But they're kind of able to change this relationship, protect the habitat with the animals, and help undermine the illegal trade in these species in ways that can help manage the direct use in order to kind of lead to overall population recoveries.
I think the vicuña is one of my favorite examples. I mean, probably because they are a really charismatic species and they are really like cute. But it's also interesting when you think about the interplay of the fashion industry in this. So because it's now such a rare, but also it's a rare fiber from a charismatic species that's very kind of like culturally relevant, it then becomes something highly desirable. And obviously you have like Loro Piana, who are a Italian company owned by LVMH, and they claim to be the world's largest cashmere manufacturer, but they also actually use a lot of vicuña fiber, and the coats made from vicuña fiber sell for like £22,000. And I think this is a really interesting way of viewing conservation. I mean, obviously this is not an equitable solution, and it does rely on like the super rich's consumption, but it's also on the flip side, it's like at least they're consuming something that helps the planet. Like this isn't them flexing their wealth in a way that destroys the planet, like having a yacht. They're actually in some kind of twisted way using their money for good, and you're targeting their desire for luxury, but twisting it to get the conservation outcomes that you also need.
I think that there's a really interesting interplay there, especially with the fashion industry, because as we've been talking about kind of things like crocodile leather or vicuña fiber, these are actually products that almost exclusively go into like really high-end luxury goods. Joe Blow is not going to go buy a crocodile skin wallet from H&M, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to be getting that from someone like Hermes, or you're going to be getting it from Louis Vuitton. Like those are really the only outlets that can afford to purchase these kind of high-end leathers. And I think that that's definitely an interesting interplay, because on one end, I think that kind of maybe reserving these kind of things for specialty or high-end markets probably is good in a sense where it actually has like a natural cap in terms of how much use there's going to be for this. But then on the other end, I think that there's associated fear with actually chasing that supply chain a little bit. So they're going to probably be a bit coy with, where is this crocodile leather sourced from? What communities did you work with to source it? And because a lot of these are kind of products that are necessarily seen as like going to the ultra rich from exotic landscapes, people probably don't necessarily want to see that level of accountability, when actually I think it should be really inversed, where by having really clear supply chains in a lot of these different leather and fiber products, you both can make sure that the communities are being equitably compensated for these really high-end and expensive goods, but you can also make sure that your goods are being sustainably sourced from these populations that we know can provide healthy and sustainable leathers and fibers. So I think that some of the avoidance around that some people share around this, even though they buy these high-end luxury goods, kind of defeats a little bit some of the empowerment that they could be kind of pushing forward by really making sure that these companies are actively sourcing really sustainable goods and actively compensating these communities in the best way possible for what they're being provided.
And I guess that's the benefit of having an organization like CITES. Like initially I was so shocked that it's even an international body that advocates for trade, but understanding that actually they are advocating for trade, but what they're really doing is making sure that it's regulated and that these animals are protected. And that I think the thing that I found interesting is that if you allow trade of endangered species, it also can reduce illegal and unregulated harvest and trade, because you're giving this an outlet.
And I mean, I think it's all in moderation, right? Where there's some species that we've tried trading them, it doesn't work. Their populations don't recover fast enough, they don't breed quick enough, and we have international bans on them. And there are some species that thrive under legalized trade models. And I think that studies like the one that we're talking about here that came out looking at that trade are really, really important. But I think it also requires us to have a bit of self-reflection in terms of where do we place values on a lot of these different things. So, for example, you have domestically bred fish populations transported outside of their home countries that can then get out into those rivers and outcompete native sturgeon species. And I don't know if you've ever Googled the fish that makes caviar. It's a sturgeon, and they're definitely not the cutest thing you could imagine. I personally think they're super cute, but I definitely see why someone would prefer giraffes or vicuña or rhinos or elephants over a sturgeon. But we need to actually be able to dive into that kind of trade data and understand when things are harming us, or not harming us, harming nature, and when things are actually benefiting nature, and kind of be able to remove our feelings from it a little bit. So, for example, the caviar trade still is legal under CITES because so many efforts are made by really wealthy corporations and really wealthy countries to kind of intervene to keep that trade going. And then they try to go for more low-hanging fruit of trades that are actually really sustainable to try and score quick wins is kind of compensation for allowing these trades that are really unsustainable to keep going. So, for example, another one that was really controversial for a really long time was bluefin tuna, because it's super popular in sushi restaurants. And so it's kind of just reframing our lens from, are we criticizing this trade because we think it's genuinely harmful, or are we criticizing this trade because it lies outside of our Western perceptions of what okay use of wildlife is?
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, thinking about like the cultural impact of things and how fashion is what is probably one of our biggest, we have fashion, food and music, and if we could readdress this relationship through fashion, that would be such a positive vehicle for change. I think this has been a really interesting conversation in how we break down our kind of presumptions that we have around trade and environmental protection, and really thinking about analysing data and being realistic and being pragmatic. I think sometimes we have this idea that there's going to be like a one-size-fits-all solution, and I think that definitely plays in when we talk about protecting species. We have this idea of almost an Eden or a Narnia where every animal can just be left to be wild and it'll all be fine, but actually in a realistic sense we still live under a capitalist system, and sometimes we have to do pragmatic approaches like this. It's been really great to hear from you about how passionate you are about the biodiversity crisis and to learn what it is, how we can manage biodiversity. So where can the listeners find you if they want to learn more about the biodiversity crisis?
You can find me on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, whatever. All of them are under Zethdafer, so like Zethdafer. But yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and thank you so much to Seth for being involved. You can find him on TikTok and Instagram. I'll put his handles in the show notes. See you all next week. And in the meantime, I'd love it if you could leave a rating review of the podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts. Bye!